All right, so hi everybody, I'm Chris Giordano. My wife Claire and I moved to the neighborhood about a year ago. I'm looking forward to meeting more folks as time goes by. I asked a few questions about this topic when it came up a few months ago, and then I said something, and now I've been voluntold that I will be the guy to kick off the sharing of the feedback from our neighborhood. So Gene put me in this role because I know how to use PowerPoint. So that's pretty much my role so far. So I will try to cover the feedback from our neighborhood and the input that Gene brought together in 5 or 10 minutes. I'll try to go through it really quickly, and then we can get into a session that Jimbo will moderate where folks can dialogue directly with the planners about the proposed edit and how it will impact our neighborhood. It'll be a live discussion once I get through just the summary here. So let me start by just introducing again a quick agenda here, right? So I'll introduce the planners, I'll give that summary, and then we'll get right into the Q&A. So Anya Grand-Federmach is on. If you guys have done town council stuff on this topic, you've met Anya and you've met Taz Lagu as well. Judy Johnson is also on. There may be a few others who've joined from the town, but I saw Anya has a graduate degree in historic preservation, so she knows a great deal about this topic and probably intimately and innately knows the kind of concerns that folks like us have with development proposals in a neighborhood like ours. I looked Taz up on LinkedIn as well, and I'll just say, let's be careful about what we say about UNC students on this call, because Taz has been a UNC student for, I would have to guess, half of his life. He has 3 degrees so far. I'm sure he never attended a student party that got out of control in our neighborhood, though. These guys have been in dozens of sessions like this. I'm sure a lot of you who are on today have seen them in that mode. I've heard from people all over Chapel Hill about their thoughts. So tonight is kind of specific to our neighborhood, and it's a chance to get into the details with the planners. And the good news is they've walked the neighborhood. They've met with Gene Pavaromo in detail to hear about some of the concerns we have with renters, with students, how much we love them, but also don't love their parking lots, etc. They've met with neighbors on that walk. They kind of know some of the quirks that have given us, some interest in the topic, at least. And so again, we can really get kind of into the specifics. I know from reading everything that came in from the neighborhood to Gene that we'll do that in a really engaged and passionate way. And I think these guys do invite debate, which is great, but in an energetic and respectful way tonight as well. So let me try to just jump right in. So 2 slides here kind of summarizing the positive, the feelings of those who in general are supportive of this in all the feedback that came in. That one's first, and then a slide showing with some quantification you can see in the color on the screen there. A second slide showing for those who are against it, what their concerns are. Interesting, the key finding here is essentially that we should move ahead. We shouldn't slow this down. We don't need to delay it. There's been work going on for a year. These are the right goals for the town, and it's a real problem, and it's a real problem that affects the whole planet and the nation, et cetera. We should do something about it. But even in those positive comments that are supportive of moving forward, there were a lot of caveats about the possibility of high-end development, student rental development, or the combination of those. Let's see, students are good. If you look at the bottom of the feedback here, what do you expect? I thought that was a great piece of content. This is what we should have by a university, and we do have it, and we shouldn't, try to keep students out of the neighborhood. This is the right way to preserve the neighborhood that we have. I thought this was interesting, right? This is the way to create gradual positive change and to preserve what we've got in our neighborhood, was an argument that was made. If you look at the quantification, right, the most common theme here, there isn't enough middle income housing, and this will make it more available. That's at the core, I think, of the let's move ahead argument. The font on this slide is a little harder to read. I apologize for that, but that essentially shows you there's basically a kind of a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 balance in terms of the feedback that came in from those who'd say, let's not move ahead, or let's not move ahead without a lot more work. You know, there's a consistent view that the developers are just uncontrollable, and that's going to push the costs up, and that the preservation, the goals of preservation and the goals of development simply won't be aligned, whatever we think. You can see there at the top in the key finding, there's different degrees of opposition. Flat out, we don't want this at all, don't do it, stop it, versus in almost every case, people do share the goals, but they want to slow down, and they basically say, if we can't do it right, or we think it's not going to work, let's not do anything, right? Kind of a first do no harm response to the proposal. I think in general, you can see there's kind of 11 or 12 mentions of several topics. It's not going to preserve the character. There isn't a sufficient plan. I think a lot of the critique, and I think we heard this in the first session with the town, you've got to have this thing completely thought out and nail down every problem if you're going to do it. I think if you look again at the previous slide, those who are in favor of pushing ahead are worried about that kind of thinking for a reason. There's a lot of content here about negative environmental impacts as well, the trees, et cetera. And then I would say there's a strong expression of externalities, right? A lot of people are worried about collateral damage, and there's a lot of detail in the feedback about the streets, the trees, the parking, et cetera. So again, just trying to be quick here, guys. Try to show for and against here. I think the finding on the far right, that environment is not talked about by those who are for this proposal, is an erroneous finding. I think environment is at the heart of across the country when this topic comes up. Commuting is bad, preserving the environment is good. I think that's just an erroneous finding. You could say that those who are against it are we're just whining all the time, like we hit every topic in the analysis here. I think it's interesting that you show here those who are in favor, they believe it will work, right? There is a real sense that this is a doable proposal and it'll get us better housing. Those are the key findings. Whereas, I didn't cover this on the previous slide, but for those who don't like it, this is one of the biggest areas of differentiation. They really just don't like the proposal itself, the way it's playing out, and essentially, they don't think it can work. So again, enough from me, even though I did want to try to quickly summarize what you guys sent in, and thanks so much to everybody for doing that. Last slide from me before we get into the first couple questions for Taz and Anya and Judy and others. I tried to just quantify here. A lot of assertions were made in the feedback, but there were also questions and suggestions, kind of specifically at Jean's request. And a lot of the questions were basically challenges. So again, you start to see, we just don't think you can do it. The achievability is not there. There's too many collateral damages. But you also start to see questions and suggestions over here about, what if you did it this way? The design specific topic came up a lot, and the development approval process came up a lot. So I just took this as an indication. You folks may agree or not. It's a bit of my interpretation that while there's no monolithic view in the neighborhood for sure, most folks are saying, please don't do this, or please don't do it yet, or think about how to preserve our neighborhood and neighborhoods like us before you do it. There seems to be a lot of will to work on a development process and to ask about what could we do, essentially. So with that, again, I'll ask you, Anya, Taz, a couple of questions here just to get the discussion going. And then, so we have plenty of time for everybody. We'll let Jimbo jump in and start doing more of a live Q&A. But I thought this was probably the best question to just get us a meaty discussion going. I'll try to read some of this. How does the proposal ensure that housing that arises as a result of the change will be in keeping with the existing and often historic look and feel of the neighborhood. In some neighborhoods, could the plan evolve to ensure new development must adhere to the character and appearance of the homes predating it? I put in parentheses here, let's not go into the whole fact that some neighborhoods have historic review committees and some don't. I think a lot of us know that in Cameron McCauley, for example, that exists. In some of Westwood, much of Westwood, it doesn't. But the note here was, as proposed, the design is voluntary and town staff can simply approve construction that meets certain criteria. I think there was even a reference in one of the comments to a specific part of the proposal where you guys could basically say, yeah, you don't have to go further in the process. It looks good to us. So could we do the opposite, essentially, right? And then the second part of this is, again, how do we make sure, right, with this proposal that the housing that becomes available doesn't become student housing for those who are closest to the universe, and instead does become middle income housing, right? And how could we plan for young professors, ideally, right? Thinking of people who can afford a nice home, but not necessarily extremely nice, et cetera, that they don't just get gobbled up. Like, how do you protect that? So that's the conversation starter, and I'll come back in with the next two questions before Jimbo takes over in a little bit.
Chris, first of all, thank you guys so much for the thought and effort that y'all have clearly put into preparing for this. I think I've told some of y'all we really wish we had been able to have this meeting earlier with y'all, and we apologize we had to reschedule. But this is already shaping up to be just such a great model for what we had hoped. I think a lot of our other neighborhood meetings would have looked like. So thank you for that. I think I'm going to ask Anya to address the first question, and I can jump in on the second part.
So Taz can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the state very much limits how much design review we can do for single family and two family developments that are outside of historic districts. That said, we have been looking into some of the infill residential standards that cities like Raleigh and Durham have adopted that really hone in on how to make sure that when you build a new house in an existing neighborhood, that it does reflect the character and the appearance of the homes that are already existing. And so in the draft ordinance that we had shared with the town council back in January, we did have some neighborhood compatibility standards in there that relate to things like the orientation of the building, trying to think about putting parking on the side or behind the building so it's not the prominent feature on the streetscape, building widths, roof forms, fenestration patterns, so your windows and doors, things like materials, things that can really help a new development blend in with its surroundings. And Chris, you are correct. Under the current proposal that we've been sharing with folks, it would be an administrative approval. So that means that it's up to staff to determine whether or not those criteria in the neighborhood compatibility standards are met. And I think we define the neighborhood compatibility as neighborhoods that have been platted for at least 20 years and at least 50% of the block is single family, so that we really are honing it in on existing neighborhoods. But I'm sure you all will have some great feedback on how we can improve those design standards. And then Taz, I don't know if you want to talk about the student housing piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So student housing is, I think, another one of those concerns that we have heard from a lot of neighborhoods, as y'all can imagine, particularly neighborhoods basically in walking distance of campus, where you would expect there to be a strong demand for student housing. I think a recurring theme as we've grappled with how to best structure some of these reforms is that we have significant limitations, right, based on what state law allows local governments to do from a zoning perspective. One of those limitations, which really cuts to the core of local government zoning authority, is that we have to regulate in a totally occupant agnostic way, right? So we can't regulate who lives in a home. That being said, we have also heard and certainly recognize that certain forms of housing are more likely to generate the sort of development incentives or financial incentives that might lead to more student-focused housing, right? So in terms of how this proposal could evolve in order to move away from some of the risks that I think we've heard from a lot of folks that they are particularly concerned about the student housing risk that's posed by fourplexes and triplexes, right? Because the development incentives, the pro forma starts to look a lot better for a developer if they can put 4 units on a lot. And so one of the things that we are very much working to kind of factor into the evolution of this is being more strategic about where fourplexes and triplexes would be permitted. And making sure that we are not over incentivizing the sort of development that's going to lead to an overabundance, right, of student-based housing. I think if you start to look at things like duplexes, if you start to look at what it would look like to allow a lot that currently has a single-family home to build a something larger than our traditionally allowed ADUs, which are really capped at 750 square feet. If you could put, one more kind of family-oriented home on a lot like that, you might not have the same development pressures because you won't have the same incentives, right, that would lead to just a student stuffer. And so I think the way to kind of sum all of that up is we don't have the authority or the power to regulate who would live in a home, but we can think really strategically about what types of homes we're allowing. And we think the lower density homes like duplexes, like accessory apartments are more likely to offer up opportunities that aren't just going to be immediately utilized for student housing.
All right, so I think that leads well to the next question. And I think what made this one and a few others jump out to me was this kind of this demand for evidence, right? Do you have data, right? What about in neighborhoods specifically like ours? And so I think the request here was, can we provide some evidence that this won't hurt our neighborhood and that will actually achieve the goal, right? Since that's one of the biggest reasons why people who are opposed say they're opposed. Is there evidence, specific to neighborhoods like ours, specific to neighborhoods by campus, that we can actually achieve the goal and not let that occur, given what you just said, right? And then is there a way that we can basically keep the parking a little less visible, keep the streets small, keep the trees? Is there what can we do to amend it for a neighborhood, a handful of neighborhoods maybe, where it seems like the risks of those things are the highest? This seems like a solution oriented, but also kind of a challenging question.
Yeah. So I think it is really important, and we have been trying to do our best to make it clear what exactly the goals of this proposal are. I know that many of us are professionals in various fields, and all professionals are at times guilty of getting caught in the jargon of their own profession. And I think that there's definitely been, I think we can admit that there has been some inarticulate or inartful messaging around the term missing middle housing. When we use the term missing middle housing, we're strictly referring to form. I think when a lot of people hear the term missing middle housing, it is very natural to assume that there is an element of middle income embedded in that. And that is, like I said, we have realized how embedded that assumption is as we've talked to more folks. But this proposal is very much not geared with an explicit goal of creating more housing for middle income individuals or families, right? We see that as a potential opportunity, but it's not an outcome that we sought to guarantee through these reforms, right? And so I think in some ways the question of, is there data to support this particular goal? There, as far as we know, there is, some information out there saying that when you increase housing stock, when you increase the ability to build various sizes of homes, you do create more opportunities for a diversity in prices, but it's not guaranteed. And that's why we're certainly not trying to hang our hat on the affordability aspect of this. The goal is diversity of housing types as a good in and of itself. And if additional affordability comes of that, we certainly hope it would, and there's reason to believe that it could, but we don't anticipate that it's a guarantee.
Okay. All right, good. I'm going to hit one more. And this one was pretty specific about the history of the ADUs. Right? Town council seems to believe that the rezoning will result in people building houses or condos that families can buy or rent. This was also the assumption when they allowed accessory dwelling units to be built anywhere. So how many were built? After council sweetened the deal by allowing ADUs to be used as short-term rentals, how many were built? And then how many infill developments during that period have resulted in multifamily?
So I can address the ADU question. We did a quick search a while back, and from looks like between the time that ordinance was passed in 2015 till about 2021, 2022, we had about 39 new accessory apartments that were constructed. The majority of them look like they were either basement renovations or above garages. There was a few associated with like brand new ones or a new outbuilding. And then we are still collecting short-term rental permits. And so I can't say how many ADUs are being used as short-term rentals. But it does look like between 2021, when that ordinance got passed, till last year, we had about 5 new ADUs.
Okay.
So we didn't see a huge jump in the number of accessory apartments if you consider, roughly 40 over a 7-year span.
Okay. All right. At that point, Jimbo, take the reins. The natives are restless.
All right. Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for taking the time to hop on. Thank the staff especially. Thank you guys a ton for doing this after hours, and thanks to folks in the neighborhood who've hopped on as well. So we'll open this up to sort of a somewhat free range Q&A. The way that I'll try to run this is hopefully everybody's on mute, and I can, if you will look at the bottom of your screen and you see the icon reactions, one of those reactions will be to raise your hand. And so if you've got a question, hit the raise hand button, and I'll try to get to as many folks as we can in the remaining time. In an effort to get to as many people as we can, try to keep your initial question just to a single question, not 3 or 4. And then once we get through everybody once, we'll come back and we can do follow-up. And I know some folks are going to be anxious to make a pitch for why the proposal is great or terrible or whatnot. It's okay to stake out your position early, but if you could lean in more to the question, because I think a lot of folks are on the call to get clarification about how the proposal would function, and not necessarily hear everybody's stump speeches about the proposal itself. So with that, if you've got questions, go ahead and hit the raise hand button, and when I call on you, you can take yourself off of mute, and we can get going. Make sure I'm not, oh, there we go. So Andrew, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks for the staff to filling us in and giving us the insight. I guess the question is, I mean, it seems like we can't restrict, or you don't have the power to restrict architecture of any new development. You can't really just restrict. You have some ability to restrict, but not full ability to restrict what gets built and how big it is and where it gets built. And it doesn't seem, which also based on that, you know, obviously can't really stop trees from getting cut down and things like that. So those are, you know, generally the three biggest issues, I think, for the neighborhood. And so the question is there any way, or is it, what's the process if that's where we end up? Is there a process where we can, you know, get a historic designation so that we can have these restrictions put in place so that it doesn't change the overall, you know, makeup of the neighborhood?
If I can put a fine point on that a little bit to expand, because I think this is going to be a common theme for a lot of folks, and it plays off of the first and second question that were asked at the top. I think a lot of folks in the neighborhood, but both those that are in the generally supportive camp and those that are in the more reticent camp, share some anxiety over what controls you guys have, albeit indirect controls. It's clear from what you said, you don't have direct controls over a lot of this, including student housing and the like. If you could speak a little more specifically to the indirect controls you guys have that might affect, you know, the aesthetic risk we face, you know, the canopy risk that was mentioned, the student housing risk. If you could walk a little bit, you alluded to it initially, but if you could walk through that a little more specifically, it might help address both Andrew's question and a lot of other folks' questions as well. Andrew, is that fair, or did I just butcher your initial question?
No, I mean, I think that's totally fair. It's like if we understood what could be built where, and just have like, you know, what is the new game plan or the new landscape going to look like? It'd just be helpful for us to get behind if we saw the logic or we saw like some rhyme and reason. But I think that's what's missing in our minds, that it could, you know, anything can happen anywhere, any size, any architectural, you know, and all trees can be torn down. That's everybody's fear. At least that's my fear. And so that's what it'd be good to understand, if there is anything that we can point to and say, all right, this is what it's gonna, this is like the most density, and this is how the density would lay out under a full build out under the new regulation. So what that would look like?
Yeah, I think, Andrew, the fear is absolutely understandable. I think we have heard variations of it's, you know, the everything everywhere all at once sort of concern. And I will say, you know, you mentioned the what, where, and how big criteria, right? Those, fortunately, are the things that are very much within the traditional wheelhouse and the traditional powers of a local government to regulate. And those really are what we plan to lean into, right? Of thinking strategically about what size, you know, what type of dwellings we're allowing in neighborhoods, whether that's duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, or taking a more limited approach and just doing the kind of the next increment up from what y'all currently have of primarily single family. The next small increment up from that would be, you know, maybe just duplexes. And so that is something that we are very much still soliciting a lot of feedback on, and we have not wedded ourselves, right, to saying that the R1s and R2 zones are going to have everything on up to a fourplex. I think we're still very much open to limiting that to lower densities. And same goes with things like tree canopy, right? I think as proposed, we have included tree canopy coverage requirements for things like triplexes and fourplexes. We absolutely could look at what it would mean to include those sorts of requirements, not only for triplexes and fourplexes, but potentially also for duplexes, two-family units, whatever you may want to call them. We can also look at strengthening the requirements that are being proposed, right? I think we have heard from a lot of folks that they are concerned that even if we do have tree canopy coverage requirements, that still leaves open the possibility that a lot with a lot of mature trees could get clear cut, and then have that tree canopy requirement satisfied by planting new trees. We can look into, for example, limits on how much of a lot could be disturbed when you're doing new construction, right? Limits or regulations that would require the preservation of a certain percentage of existing tree canopy rather than just looking at what's the final outcome. And so those are all still opportunities for us to keep evolving the proposal, because they are, I think, very genuine concerns that we're hearing from a lot of neighborhoods, just like yours.
That's helpful, Taz. Other questions? I mean, I will say, as I'm waiting for hands to go up, that to the degree you guys can, whenever there's another iteration, provide maybe a clearer picture on how the indirect constraints that you've got in place might impact, what could go up and where. I know it's embedded in a lot of the different regs, whether it's the historic commission, constraints or whatever. It has been a little hard to track for those of us trying to understand what the sort of tail risk of all this is, what the extreme might be. So to the degree you, as you iterate on this, can lay that out in a way that's digestible for folks, I think it'll help you tell your story in a way that gives those that are already close to being comfortable more comfort, and maybe those that are anxious a little less anxiety. Dan, you want to shoot?
Yeah. Thanks everybody for your time. A quick question just on that idea of it's really about form and not about a price point. One, I think that there's even been some, I think even the mayor has had some quotes that might go against that. So I get it that it's hard to kind of rein people in, right? But let's just take the most proximate example of the Hayes-Barton situation in Raleigh, where a single family home is torn down and I don't know, 10 or 15 $million duplexes go in. Given what you say about form, would that be a success under this plan?
It's really hard to say. Obviously, we don't want the Hayes-Barton situation to happen here. I would not call that a success. I think we have heard from folks, well, look at the context of Hayes-Barton, right? Those may be $1 million homes that are coming up, but they're surrounded by $5 million homes. So in the context of the neighborhood, maybe that form is creating different price points, even though they're not affordable by a broader consideration of that. That being said, I think we are learning from examples just like Hayes-Barton, and very much want to avoid outcomes like that.
Great, thank you.
Victoria?
Hi, I guess my question is around the analysis of the existing housing stock within the neighborhood and what has been done about that. Because I think if the goal of this is really to increase the diversity of housing types, in my mind, if you walk down Macaulay Street from one end to the other, you have a multitude of existing housing types. You have duplexes, you have cottage courts, you have condominiums for sale, you have rental apartments, you have all of that. And then as you move towards certainly West University and Woodland, you have larger homes on larger lots that are single family. As you continue moving in that direction towards Dawes, Coolidge, Woodland, Smith, you get back into a real diverse housing stock of duplexes, triplexes. And I'm just curious what analysis has been done about what we already have in the neighborhood, and then how are we different from Gimghoul that seems to be more larger houses on large lots without the diversity?
Yeah, I don't know that we have done, Victoria, I think we are intimately aware of the great diversity of housing that you've mentioned. Really characterizes that the entire section of Chapel Hill, right, from Cameron Macaulay down into Westwood. And in a lot of ways, it's an example of what we point to of what a community can evolve into when missing middle housing types and a diverse housing stock gets integrated into the kind of urban form of a neighborhood. In many ways, y'all are a shining example of what other neighborhoods in town could look like if they're allowed to evolve. I think a lot of the duplexes and other kind of traditional missing middle housing that you see in your neighborhood, it's older. We definitely have seen issues with that, and they were allowed to be built at a time when before kind of the modern clampdown on just allowing single family homes kind of crept into the zoning and planning professions. I think I'll hand things over to Anya though in terms of just, a little further discussion on that.
So I'll make sure to put in the chat here momentarily that the town has done some housing studies in the past, and those studies have found that we've been really good at building single family, and we've been really good at building multifamily, and not much in between. And I think, as you just pointed out, there is a really good mix of different housing styles in the downtown area. And one of the things that we've been doing as planners is walking around both the neighborhoods downtown as well as a little bit further out, and really thinking about the types of housing forms in those neighborhoods, what's working, what's not working. And I think even like walking through Westwood the other day, we noticed that you have a lot of much smaller duplexes that were probably built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that are very different from some of the newer brand new student housing developments that have gone in and are probably receiving a lot more enforcement complaints. And so we're trying to figure out what makes one work and what doesn't, why isn't the other one working as well. So let me put those studies in the chat for everybody.
Anya. Other questions while I'm waiting on folks to think of questions. If and as folks have other feedback questions, what's the best medium through which to send it to you guys? And we tend to hyperventilate on listserv, and I'm not always sure what makes it out of that bubble into the hands of those that actually have some control over all this. So what's the, for those folks who are interested enough to have taken time out to be on the call and may have follow-up questions, concerns, especially as you guys iterate and the target moves a little bit, what's the best way to weigh in or get clarification?
So we have a number of ways that you can participate. If you registered for tonight's call, I'll make sure to add you to the email listserv. So you have we'll make sure to send out some email blasts and keep you all posted on the progress that's being made. We also have the project website where we're listing both the dates of upcoming meetings, and we also have a frequently asked questions. So you can scroll through that. They're organized by theme. I will put those things in the chat. There's also, we have a public input webpage. And then I will also give you my and Taz's email address. We're probably not perfect at answering every email and every question, but we'll try to at least direct you to some of the work that's already been done or add it to our frequently asked questions. But let me fill up your chat here for a minute.
That's great. Before you bury Benjamin's question in your contribution to the chat, and thank you for what you're about to put in the chat. Let me read that, and then I'll go to Alan's question, or let Alan ask his question. And this is something you sort of alluded to, at least indirectly already, but if you guys come away with all of the outreach that you're doing with a sense that there is a common anxiety about pace and uncertainty here, which are obviously related for a lot of folks, what are the tools you've got to slow things down a little? You mentioned one, which is, moving from, opening things up to all the way to quadruplexes to maybe toggling it back to duplexes, at least first, to see how that plays out, increasing some of the existing constraints that you've got in place for triplexes and duplexes and applying them to duplexes, like the canopy requirement, maybe cranking that up even a little bit relative to what it is now. Are there other tools, like limiting the number of permits under the new plan? I mean, what are the other ways in which you might consider toggling things back a little bit if you feel the need ultimately?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we have really worked to come up with what some potential guardrails could be, right? Because we don't want this to just explode right on the community. We have seen from other communities that have passed missing middle housing reforms that there hasn't been, right, a major development explosion as a result of these types of reforms. But Chapel Hill is Chapel Hill, and so we don't want to just rely on the experience of other communities. And so some of those guardrails could be, Jimbo, as you mentioned, one clear option would be to have some sort of annual quota on the number of permits that are offered or issued for some of these new missing middle housing types. That obviously could limit construction on a town-wide basis. We've also heard, well, what if my street is going to see, a wave of new construction? How do we limit an overly, fast pace of change at like a hyper local level? And there, what we could be looking at are things like minimum separation requirements. So, for example, that could be structured like a prohibition on adjacent properties being developed into fourplexes or whatever the housing type ends up being. It could be an adjacency based separation requirement. It could be a distance based, so at least 200 feet or what have you between different housing types. And so those are some of the kind of additional guardrails that could be implemented, and it's certainly something that we're planning to think about as far as how the proposal could evolve.
That's helpful. Alan, you're on mute. Actually, I can see if I can unmute you. There we go.
That better?
Yeah, it's better.
Well, first of all, thank you, folks. I mean, particularly the judgment that you're willing to make, potentially willing to draw this back to just duplexes rather than threeplexes and fourplexes and 12plexes and so on is appreciated. I think that really does help a lot. But I'd like to focus just for a second on the idea that you do not have the authority to determine what sort of structure is being built. And I think that's wrong. Now, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a municipal lawyer. I'm not a housing lawyer or a development lawyer. So I haven't read any of those details. But I do know that you have a lot of flexibility in the process by which you approve a new construction. So for example, why is it that we don't allow adjacent property owners to be notified, to be able to review the plans, make adjustments, and have some process by which maybe not even limited to town staff. Maybe things have to go to the council, and at least give an opportunity for the kinds of feedback which would allow the community to have a voice in individual construction.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
Thanks, Alan. I think it's a really good question, and I think it is worth clarifying, right? So what gets built is fully within the town's purview, right, to regulate. Depending on what gets built, our ability to regulate what it looks like changes pretty significantly, right? So based on town law, or based on state law, excuse me, the local government is not allowed to really regulate the design of single family homes, duplexes, and other things that are regulated under the North Carolina Residential Building Code. We can regulate the size and scale and mass of those types of homes, but we can't regulate, paint color, siding, or, cladding materials, those types of design elements. Once we get into things like triplexes or fourplexes, we're actually freed up to have significantly more prescriptive design standards. And that's just generally the trend, right? As the scale of the construction goes up, the local government's authority to regulate its design also increases. And so we very much can regulate what gets built, where it gets built. It's the who, and in some cases the what it looks like questions that can't be regulated.
I'm also really glad that you brought up the question about process and, whether the process is administrative or it goes to another body like the Planning Commission or the Town Council. And so one of the reasons that we've included an administrative review of triplexes and fourplexes is because that's something that came out of the future land use map, or the flume. It talks about, ways that we can incentivize or encourage missing middle housing types, I guess, such as triplexes and fourplexes. And it mentions how it might be appropriate to administratively approve them in some scenarios. I think currently the process for building any multifamily gets to be very cumbersome. And I think, and because of that, you see a lot more larger multifamily complexes instead of the smaller multifamily or smaller apartment buildings.
Jean? Let's see if
I found
there we
it. Okay. Well, I also want to say thank you to the town. It's really encouraging how much outreach you've been doing to so many neighborhoods, so many different forums to allow us to comment. And it sounds to me, I'm very encouraged about what I'm hearing tonight. It sounds to me like your thinking's evolving, you're learning from these conversations, you're considering the changes. So here's my question. Is it possible to pilot this before rolling it out all across the town so that we continue to learn? We, look at what it really means on the ground if you do setbacks here, or if you do a tree canopy at this percentage, and allow those lessons to then be factored into whatever the final rollout is of the amendment?
Yeah. Thanks, Gene. I think the notion of a pilot program has definitely been discussed. We've heard a lot of interest in that. I think you could look at it two ways, right? There's a geographic pilot, right, where you carve out a particular part of town or parts of town and decide that these are going to be the pilots. I think we see it more as kind of a temporal issue, right? I think it's really hard to imagine even what it would look like to try to say this neighborhood here is going to be the pilot neighborhood, right? But what we can do, and I think what is a more equitable approach, is to say that staff will monitor implementation of these proposals incredibly closely. There are a lot of metrics that we're able to track and that we would intend to track and report back to council on really whatever basis or whatever frequency they want, right? And that gives them the ability to adjust course if needed, right? Council has expressed interest in being able to adjust course as needed, and we think that monitoring and reporting is gonna be the best way to make sure that we're learning from how this implementation rolls out around town.
And in the experience of Chapel Hill, once you roll out and allow that kind of scale of development, how easy is it to rein in? I mean, is there a history of making big adjustments or setting a new course? I don't know if anyone knows that.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say because this is, in some ways, this is a big change. In other ways, given the relatively small or relatively, minor pace of change or pace of development that we expect to see from this, I think it's very unlikely, right, that you would see so much momentum build up that it would become kind of an unstoppable ship, right, or an unstoppable train, right? I think with some of the other large scale changes, like Blue Hill, for example, tremendous amount of momentum built around that. I don't think it would be a similar situation here. So there's really going to be an opportunity to slow down, to adjust course, whatever's needed.
I mean, another version of a pilot is just the incrementalism that you were suggesting at the beginning. If you cranked up some of the requirements you've already sort of imagined, canopy and so forth as an example, cranked it down to duplexes, that functions a little like a pilot to see how things go. But, Martin, you have a question?
It's not really a question, but I'm afraid if I wait any longer, I won't be able to say something and it may reset the conversation a little bit. I think many of us here were at the School of Public Health when Kurt called a meeting and Karen Stegman and Michael Parker came, talked to us about what the housing problem is and what the goals are for this amendment. And the three goals that I got from it were affordable, walkable, owner-occupied. Something we talked about here, but they were pretty clear in my view that they wanted owner-occupied housing. Of those three things, the only one that I understand operationally is owner-occupied. I can tell that. I don't know what's walkable. I don't know what's affordable. Now, maybe the town has an idea of what all of that is. My further understanding is that there are over 250 neighborhoods in this town. Many of them have homeowner associations and covenants. My further understanding is that data is not readily available to the town. So my question is, are we talking about something here that's going to affect 200 neighborhoods, 100 neighborhoods, 4 neighborhoods, maybe just the neighborhoods that surround the university? I mean, if that's the case, we're talking about something that is very broad in scope and very limited in effect. I thought about something else. I am very sympathetic to people finding housing in Chapel Hill. All right. And I look at all the apartments that are going up. I have no idea what the numbers are. We're building and building and building. And my understanding is, from a brief conversation, that they're kind of expensive. And that for the people we would like to house, they might not be affordable. One suggestion that I have, and I don't know how feasible it is, is to get a bunch of towns together who are dealing with this problem, and clearly they are because they have middle housing amendments. Go to the state legislature and say, okay, man, it's time for us to deal with rent control. And if we rent controlled some of these apartments, we'd be able to solve a problem in a much shorter time than this proposed amendment, which even if it gets passed, is going to take years, in my view at least, to have any reasonable effect on what's going on. That's my piece. Thank you.
Martin, thanks a lot for those observations and questions. I think I'll try to get to them in reverse order. I agree. Yeah, I mean, rent control would be a major boon for affordable housing around the state. I think, unfortunately, many of y'all, I'm sure, are very aware of the political dynamics around the state and what that's meant for the decisions that are coming out of the General Assembly. We're not holding our breath, right, for them to give local government that what could be such a amazing opportunity, right, to really make a big dent in the affordability kind of problems that so many of our communities are facing. There are a handful of champions for that cause out there, but we're not holding our breath. We would love to see a broader push for it, and I think unfortunately as staff we can't be lobbyists. We can't be out front on the political issues, but you guys can. Each and every one of y'all, I think, has the ability to be really significant advocates for that sort of change in Raleigh.
Alan, do you have a follow-up question? Oh, yeah, take yourself off mute again.
All right.
There you go.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt Tess there if there was more he wanted to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch on the covenants question that Martin posed as well. We can't say, right, for certain which neighborhoods still have covenants that are in effect. We can certainly say, and this is one of those artifacts of Chapel Hill that is something that we're grappling with, right? A lot of neighborhoods in Chapel Hill, especially those that were developed from the 60s onward, do have restrictive covenants that are, they don't mean that the neighborhoods are exempt from these zoning changes. They just mean that if somebody tries to take advantage of the opportunities that the zoning changes provide, that their neighbor would sue them, right? And so we are grappling with that, and we do understand that it means that we can't put a particular number on it, but we do definitely acknowledge that there are many neighborhoods in Chapel Hill that are not going to see these changes kind of materialize.
If I could just follow up briefly, if the affordability thing was one I raised as well, and the owner-occupied thing, the conversation here is not necessarily, in my view, focused on owner occupation. I mean, it would be nice if it happened, but some of these will be rented and all the rest of that stuff. So, I don't know if the council is unanimous about the way they think about this, but certainly what I got from Karen Stegman and Michael Parker was they wanted young people and middle-income people to be able to buy a house.
Mm-hmm.
And I, from what I'm seeing, from what we're talking about, again, if it happened, it would be a very, very incremental change in those situations. But I can say I've made the point. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate the responses, but I am very far from convinced, despite everything we're saying about what it would look like if the thing were implemented. I'm not convinced that it ought to be implemented, period. There's just nothing that suggests to me that it's going to solve a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay, Jimbo, should I pick up?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so I want to follow up on something I'd asked earlier, and there was a piece of my question that she didn't respond to. So, and that is, this is a major change, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't get everybody so upset, and the neighborhood as a whole wouldn't be so concerned about this process. What prevents you from building in the opportunity for those neighbors immediately around to have direct input on the plans that are being built? If you do that, and then the approval process is sufficiently careful after that, you can achieve the same goals that you would if you were able to do design work. It had to be very carefully crafted, but state law allows you to effect zoning, and the rules of the zoning can be strict enough so as to prevent in most cases, maybe not 100%, but 90+%, if you're willing to make sure the process is careful enough, which you're not doing now. Now it's just, if you meet the tree criteria and you meet the height criteria, it gets approved.
So Alan, I think in part it depends on what sort of outcomes you're looking for, right? One thing that we are constantly reminded by our town attorney is that the town can't indirectly do what it's not allowed to do directly, right? And so if we are not allowed to directly regulate the appearance of certain types of buildings, we can't bake in a process that attempts to indirectly regulate those elements, right?
I understand, but that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting you giving the neighbors the opportunity, and a developer who knows he's going to face that kind of 6-month delay because the neighbors are up in arms is going to rethink what his building looks like.
Yeah. And I think that certainly is a possibility. It's something that we could consider. I would say that it would generally run counter to one of the broader goals and one of the broader mandates that we have been issued from council, which is to create a more streamlined process rather than a slower process, because we know that slower processes, more uncertainty, increase cost, right? And they limit supply, and so it's something that we certainly could consider, but we have to weigh that against some of the downsides as well.
All right, one more thing, and then Jimbo, I'll shut up and let other people talk. I understand that, but you are proposing what obviously virtually everybody here believes is a radical change. And we've heard questions about pilot and incremental and so on. If you do it this way, then you'll figure out whether it's really working. In other words, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't preserve neighborhoods and then not have any careful process to be sure that they look right. So you hear the reaction. I mean, I think it's fair to say, based on the listservs that we've been reading, that the vast majority of people in this neighborhood are willing and most are supportive of the idea of building more middle housing. But we want it to be done well and consistently, and not be derogating the way the community looks. So you can't, I'll say again, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you want to be careful and you want to build support of the communities, then you have to do it in such a way that may slow down this new process a little, and at least until we figure out how it's working. All right, Jimbo Walsh.
That's right. Dan, you got a follow-up question?
Yeah. Just one quick follow-up. I mean, and just thinking about the covenant issue, I mean, has the team and the council thought that, really there's a risk here of this new plan, right? Something's going to happen. The people that can afford to avoid that risk are those that can put covenants in place, wealthier people. There's neighborhoods that can't afford that, right? That can't protect themselves. North Side may be that neighborhood that they're probably going to have a harder time, or other neighborhoods around town, to get together, a group to say, hey, let's put covenants in place. Have you thought about how it's almost reverse discriminatory?
I don't think we necessarily see it in terms of reverse discrimination. I think we know historically restrictive covenants are inequitable policies. And so we don't want to be in a situation in which we say that because there is inequity in some parts of town, we want to perpetuate that inequity everywhere, right? I think it is, I do not know really intimately what the process for creating new covenants would look like. Obviously, you can't encumber a property that owned by somebody that doesn't want it to be encumbered. You can't force covenants on somebody.
Right.
And so it would take, the agreement of at least some critical mass of people to create covenants that that have any sort of impact on a neighborhood wide scale. But again, I think we can't allow the inequity somewhere to mean inequity everywhere.
Can I take a run at something?
Yeah,
you
shoot.
probably shouldn't try to put a finer point on something.
And we're 5 minutes out from shutting this down. So I don't know if you want to offer some sort of concluding question that we can then dovetail into a conclusion generally.
What a great, thank goodness I thought of a good one. All right, so I mean, if you wrote the plan perfectly and everybody embraced it and loved it and it went through, the biggest obstacle to achieving its goals, I think, would be that probably 80 to 90% of the houses in town are in a neighborhood with bylaws that would prevent it from taking effect. So it will be piloted, I would say. There will be a period of observation, and it'll be piloted in the half a dozen neighborhoods that existed before 1960, right? That the town map in 1850 and 1950 probably weren't that different. It's 1950 to 2030 in which there's just been this enormous proliferation of housing options, all of them almost protected by bylaws. So shouldn't you expect to hear kind of a lot of pushback from the involuntary participants in the pilot, which is Gimghoul and Macaulay and Franklin? Isn't it us who are sort of objecting to it because it will be piloted here where there's this other dynamic of we're really old, we have a lot of trees, there is an interesting mix of housing options already, but any effect that the plan would really have town-wide would be concentrated on the little bit of the map that was already filled in 50, 70 years ago. Therefore, shouldn't there be a way to address that if it's going to work at all? I don't know if that's the cake and eat it too argument, but shouldn't you rezone the places that are going to otherwise be entirely impacted and find a way to get the places that are protected from it, to use that term, sorry, but insulated from it, make them do something to allow housing changes to happen?
Yeah. No, Chris, I mean, I do not at all mean to say that what we're hearing from y'all is unexpected, or it's not unexpected, it's not unreasonable. We recognize that these are genuine concerns, and we have slowed down. We want to take the time to allow this proposal to evolve in a meaningful way that cuts to a lot of the concerns that y'all are voicing, right? That's why I think this has been a really fruitful conversation, because we're hearing those concerns in a way that I think is still geared towards progressing this, but improving it, not just stopping it. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to revisit and rethink things like the tree canopy protections. Alan, I hear you. We want to make sure that that there is a balance in the process, and that within what we are allowed to regulate, that we are using those tools and those powers to the fullest extent, to make sure that what's built is not monstrous, is not out of keeping with the character of neighborhoods. We've I think put in place parts of the proposal that move us in that direction. But we do recognize that there's room for improvement, and we're gonna keep working on improving it.
Donald, you get the last question, then I'm going to wrap it up. You got to unmute yourself though. There you go.
Okay, sorry. I I wanted to make a 2 or 3 quick points. One, I'm concerned about the fact that we really, I live on Millette Street, and I'll tell you something. In the last 10 years, the term quiet enjoyment and living in the uptown area, Chapel Hill, seem to be asynchronous. They just don't exist. We've endured the redevelopment of Franklin Street. We've endured the redevelopment of University Square. We've endured the Owasso Cameron Avenue project. The concept that you really sort of have your home is your castle, and it's a nice place, and it's kind of a quiet place, and boy, has really been put to the test. And so I think one thing that you should consider is really almost a moratorium in those neighborhoods that have been subjected to this sort of redevelopment. There's not a polite way to put it. And I also want to point out, just in passing, I served on the Historic District Commission, and for those parts of our neighborhood, Cameron McCauley, which are in the Historic District, the appearance of the projects is in fact within the purview of the statute as it currently exists. And so for those properties, they're going to have to go before the Historic District Commission, and there's a lot more power embedded in the Historic District Commission that's well established for them to make decisions about how the property looks and the design issues that, excuse me, probably, but for those areas are off limits. I also wanted to point out, there's a transition that occurs over time that is, I don't know, it's discouraging. I've lived in Chapel Hill my whole life, and in the 50s and 60s on Millette Street, these homes were owner occupied, or if they were rented, they were single family homes. And of the 21 that now exist on Millette Street and Dawson Alley and Colony Court, all but 5 of them are rentals. Almost overwhelmingly, they are student rentals, and they're inappropriate rentals given the way those houses were built. They're not built for student habitation. They're almost all illegally occupied. We've seen the town demonstrate a pretty strong unwillingness to enforce things other than front yard parking in that regard. And I think you really have to consider that in a town where we already have more than 50% of housing occupied by renters, that if you're going to create additional rentals, in effect, even if it's quote middle housing, you're really upsetting, I think, a balance that generally speaking is not viewed as positive. You're going to worsen the situation. I think when we look in our neighborhood, excuse me, and specifically on Millette, there's this asymmetrical relationship. The people who are owner occupants provide stability to the neighborhood that renters don't. We're the ones who pick up the trash in our front yard. We don't have 8 cars parked in and around the property. And I guess I just wanted to express that concern because as you sort of open this up generally for the, excuse me, for the town, the prospect of unforeseen consequences is pretty significant. And for those of us who really, I think, suffered a lot as a consequence of the policies, or maybe sometimes the lack of policy in the past 10, 20 years, that's a pretty big, tough pill to swallow. So that's my thought on it, at least. And I at least would encourage you to kind of consider that some of the neighborhoods maybe ought to be put off limits for this. I mean, a reverse way of saying you pilot it is to say that neighborhoods that really borne the brunt of a lot of this redevelopment over the years, ought not to have to bear the brunt going forward. Anyway, just a thought.
Donald, I won't say much to that other than just say thank you for, I think, the perspective that kind of injects into the conversation is very much appreciated. I'll just point out, I think one thing that has become very clear in a lot of our conversations is that zoning and planning is only part of the way we move forward. We know that redoubling our efforts and our commitment to enforcement of of nuisances, right? Of making sure that people are abiding by kind of that the unwritten covenant of just being a good neighbor, not making your street worse than it was before you moved in. Those are things that we as a town definitely need to look at and bring along as we're making changes on the zoning or planning front. So really
So,
appreciate your comments.
Taz, thank you and Anya enormously for this. I want to be sensitive to your time at 7:15 at night. Really appreciate the time you guys put into this and your thoughtful answers and your willingness to hear the community's feedback. So for those of you who are interested enough in this topic to be on the call, check out the chat because Anya's put all of the places through which you can communicate with them going forward in the chat, so you're able to communicate with them directly. I will say to Taz and Anya, if and as you guys iterate on this further and come up with further developments on the idea, we'd be more than happy to engage and give you more feedback on whether or not the kind of incrementalism you may be shifting towards is the kind that might give people comfort or raise other issues or whatnot. So to the degree you want to re-engage with us, would be more than happy to hop on a call like this again in the weeks and months to come. But I would definitely, if you can, try to clarify in the next iterations, how you think about how these impediments will impact how this plays out. Because I think a lot of the questions you're hearing are generated as much by uncertainty about the implications as they are certainty about how this is going to play out. So the more certainty you can provide through examples and commentary on how the other regulations that aren't even embedded in this directly might come into effect, that sort of thing I think will help all of us understand better how to think about how it would affect our neighborhood. But again, thank you guys a ton for the time. Thanks to the neighbors for hopping on, and please do reach out if you want more feedback going forward. So thank you guys.
Thanks, Taz. Thanks, Anya.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everybody.
absolutely. Thank you all. It
you,
really
guys.
has been a pleasure. So thank you.
And good luck.
Thank you. Yeah.